The sky was eating itself. That is the only way to describe it. The only way the mind can reach for what the eyes refuse to accept. One moment there was blue, deep and Mediterranean and eternal, as it had always been above the Bay of Neapolis. And then the mountain opened, and the sky was gone. In its place rose a column of fire and blackened clouds so immense, so impossibly tall, that it seemed to punch through the heavens themselves, branching at its summit like a great stone pine, whose roots were buried in the earth's own fury. The column climbed 10 miles, 12 miles, 15 miles into the atmosphere, and began slowly, with a kind of terrible patience, to lean over the city below. It was roughly 1 in the afternoon. In the streets of Pompeii, the change arrived first as sound. A crack so deep and percussive it was felt in the chest before the ears could name it. Then a trembling, not the small familiar tremblings the city had grown accustomed to in the years since the earthquake of 62 AD, but something else entirely, something foundational, something that made the bones of every man, woman, and child understand before the mind could, that the world was no longer reliable beneath their feet. Amphorae tumbled from shelves, horses reared and screamed in their stalls, dogs snapped at their chains and howled at nothing, and above the rooftops, above the white plaster walls and the terracotta tiles baking in the August heat, a darkness was rising that was not night. Stay with this story. Stay with these people. Because what happened in Pompeii in the hours that followed was not simply the destruction of a city, it was the end of an entire living world. And it is our privilege and our sorrow to witness it. Let us go back to the morning, back to when the world was still ordinary. Dawn in Pompeii arrived as it always had, gradual and golden, threading through the high windows of 1,000 homes, washing across the mosaic floors of aristocratic villas, creeping along the narrow alleys where bakers had already been at work for hours. By the time the sun had fully cleared the Apennine hills to the east, the city was alive with the sounds that had always been its music. Pompeii, in the late summer of 79 AD, was a prosperous and confident city of perhaps 11 to 20,000 souls. It sat at the southwestern slope of Vesuvius, like a jewel in a setting of extraordinary natural beauty. The Bay of Neapolis glittering to the west, the mountain rising green and benign to the north, the fertile volcanic plain stretching in every direction to the horizon. The mountain was not feared, it was loved. Its slopes produced wine of exceptional quality, wine that traveled in clay amphorae to the furthest corners of the empire, bearing the name and reputation of this region. The rich soils nurtured olives, garum fish sauce, and grain. Pompeii was a market city, a port city, a city of commerce and pleasure and civic pride. And on the morning of August 24th, there was not a single citizen who had reason to believe this day would be anything other than what every day in August had always been. Walk through these streets with imagination as your guide. The Via dell'Abbondanza, the Street of Abundance, was the city's great artery, running east to west through the heart of Pompeii, and by mid-morning it was dense with the ordinary commotion of Roman urban life. Thermopolia, the fast food counters of the ancient world, their circular openings carved into stone counters and fitted with clay jars of warm food, were already doing brisk business. Travelers and laborers leaned on their elbows and ate standing up. Chickpeas, lentils, olives, wine diluted with water. The smell of bread from the bakeries on the side streets was thick and warm. A muleteer cursed his stubborn animal at a crossroads. Children chased one another through the legs of slower pedestrians. In the harbor district to the south, merchants were already negotiating, hands gesturing, voices rising and falling in the cadences of Roman commerce. In the elegant northern
the
quarter,
fermented
in the
fish
House of the
sauce that
Faun,
was the empire's
the grandest
universal
private
condiment,
residence in all of
was
Pompeii,
being loaded into
its
amphorae
floors
stamped
inlaid
with
with
the
the
names of the
finest
traders
mosaics in the
who would
Roman
ship
world.
it north and east.
A wealthy patrician
cloth
family
merchant
was
unrolled
moving through the
bolts of
rituals
fabric
of their
dyed in
mourning
brilliant
with the
Tyrian
unhurried
purple.
certainty of those who had
Scribes
always
bent
been
over
comfortable.
wax tablets.
The head of the household, the
Styluses moving
dominus,
quickly.
received his
A
clients
group
in
of
the atrium
slaves
after
carried
the morning
amphorae
salutatio,
stacked in a wooden
the
frame on
formal
their
greeting
shoulders,
ceremony that
their
governed the
eyes
social
downcast,
hierarchy of Roman
their feet
domestic
knowing the
life.
cobblestones
Each
by
client,
instinct.
in order of their standing, approached their patron, exchanged the correct pleasantries, received what guidance or favor they had come to seek, and withdrew. The sunlight fell through the open impluvium in the ceiling, catching the still water in the pool below, and the shadows of passing clouds moved slowly across the exquisite mosaic of Alexander the Great in battle that covered much of the floor. It had been commissioned perhaps a century before, and the family regarded it with the pride of those who believed themselves rooted in permanence. Imagine standing in that atrium. Imagine the cool of the stone underfoot, the faint smell of wood smoke and garum and perfumed oil lamps, the distant sound of the street outside muffled by thick walls. In this house, on this morning, there was no fear. There was no premonition. There was only the texture of a life being lived. But the earth had been sending its messages for some time. Those who knew how to listen, or perhaps those who simply paid attention to what the animals were doing, might have noticed the signs accumulating over the preceding days and weeks. Springs that had always flowed had gone dry. Wells across the city had been reporting strange changes in their water levels, fluctuating with no apparent cause, sometimes running sulfurous. In the days before the eruption, there had been tremors, not dramatic, not the kind to send walls tumbling, but persistent and low, a murmur beneath the stone foundations of the city that refused to entirely stop. Earthquakes were not uncommon in the region. They had rebuilt from the quake of 62 AD after all, and many of the city's buildings were still in various stages of renovation. The tremors of recent days were filed away as the earth doing what the earth sometimes did. As for Vesuvius itself, the mountain stood as it had always stood, its upper slopes dense with forest and vineyard, its summit rounded and seemingly quiescent. There were no accounts from antiquity to suggest the mountain had erupted in living memory, or in any memory passed down by word of mouth. The Romans who lived in its shadow had no name for what it truly was. They did not know the word volcano in the way we understand it. The mountain was simply the mountain, generous, fertile, permanent, a source of wealth, not a source of terror. And yet that morning, something in the animals knew. Dogs that had been tethered outside shops in the morning were, by mid-morning, straining so hard against their chains that some had worn the skin raw around their necks. Birds that had been nesting in the eaves of buildings along the southern forum were gone. All of them, simultaneously, without apparent cause. A farmer on the lower slopes of Vesuvius, who had gone up early to check his vines, found his goats bunched at the far end of their pen, packed against one corner as if pushed there by an invisible force, their eyes rolling, refusing to eat. He did not know what to make of it. He came back down to the city, uneasy, and said nothing of it to anyone. The morning passed into noon. The sun reached its apex and began its arc westward. The city slowed in the heat as it always did, the streets emptying slightly as the wealthier residents retired to their cool interior rooms, as slaves rested in whatever shade they could find, as the rhythms of commerce downshifted into the languor of the Roman midday. The Forum, which in the morning had been crowded with citizens conducting legal business and making sacrifices at the temple of Jupiter, grew quieter. The gladiatorial barracks in the southeast corner of the city were still, the gladiators themselves resting in their small cells or exercising in the shade of the courtyard's colonnade. Then, 1 in the afternoon, the mountain opened. The noise was heard as far as Misenum, more than 30 kilometers to the northwest, where the young Pliny, 17 years old, studious and observant, was sitting with his books when his mother pointed at the sky and asked what the strange cloud was. He would later describe it to the historian Tacitus in 2 letters that remain among the most extraordinary eyewitness accounts from the ancient world. The cloud, he wrote, was rising from a mountain. He could not tell which one, in a shape like a pine tree, for it rose to a great height on a sort of trunk and then split off into branches. It was white sometimes dark and mottled, as if it carried within it loads of earth and stones. In Pompeii, standing directly beneath that column, the experience was something no letter could fully contain. Follow what happens in these next moments. Follow closely, because the next hour will determine everything. The first material to fall on the city was pumice. Light, pale gray, the porous stone that floated on water, the froth of a mountain's internal violence made solid. It fell like an irregular hail, pieces ranging from the size of a thumb to the size of a fist. It was not immediately lethal. People who had run into the streets to look up at the sky, who had felt the great percussive crack of the mountain's explosion, who had watched with open-mouthed disbelief as the ash column climbed, they could still run. They could still think. The pumice tapped on their heads and shoulders and bounced off the cobblestones, and for a terrible, crucial interval, it was possible to believe that this was a thing one might survive by simply moving. The instinct to stay, to gather one's family, one's valuables, one's slaves, would cost many people their lives. In the house of a middle-class merchant near the Via dell'Abbondanza, a man we will call by the Latin shorthand of his social role, the negotiator, the trader, faced the first impossible decision. His wife and their 2 children were inside. His slaves were in the back of the house. His life's accumulations, the silver plate inherited from his father, the deeds to his property, the strong box with its coins, were locked in the back room. Outside, the pumice was coming down, and people were running past his doorway with their hands over their heads, screaming, moving south toward the harbor or east toward the gates. He told his wife to take the children and go ahead. He would follow with what he could carry. She argued, he insisted. She went. He never caught up. Archaeologists would find him centuries later in a small room at the back of the house, crouched over the strong box. His body had been encased in the volcanic material that eventually filled every room of every building in Pompeii, and when the excavators of the 18th and 19th centuries discovered the hollow space where he had been, the cavity left in the hardened pyroclastic deposit by the decomposition of his body, they injected plaster into that void. The cast that emerged showed a man curled forward over something he could not bring himself to leave. The expression on his face was hidden from us, but the posture spoke everything. Across the city, the same terrible calculus was being performed 1,000 times over. The noble family in the House of the Faun locked their valuables and moved toward the street. They carried cushions over their heads as protection against the pumice. Pliny the Younger himself would later note that this was common practice, that people tied cushions to their heads with cloth to blunt the impact of the falling stones. They moved in a group, slaves and family together in this emergency. The social hierarchies that governed every other moment of their lives temporarily suspended by the democracy of danger. Which way to go? The harbor was to the south, but the harbor would be chaos. The gates in the city walls offered escape to the roads. North toward Vesuvius itself, south toward Stabii, east toward Nuceria. East. East was away from the mountain. They went east, and they may have made it. We cannot say with certainty. The absence of their remains from the archaeological records suggests they escaped, or that whatever became of them happened elsewhere, beyond the city walls, beyond the reach of the excavation. Not everyone had that option. In the large inn near the Stabian Gate, a group of travelers, traders from other cities, people who had arrived in Pompeii on commercial business and found themselves guests of fate, debated in rising voices. The pumice was now accumulating. In the streets, it was already ankle-deep, knee-deep in some of the lower-lying areas of the city, and it was coming down faster. Roof tiles were cracking under the weight. A beam in the ceiling of a nearby building groaned, and then gave way with a crash that sent dust billowing into the street. People screamed and ran. Others, paralyzed by fear or by the sheer incomprehensibility of what was happening, sat down where they were and covered their faces with their cloaks and waited. There were, according to the archaeological evidence, at least 2 distinct phases of this disaster, and understanding them is essential to understanding why so many people died, even when the early stages of the eruption had offered windows of escape. The pumice fall was survivable if one moved quickly, but as the afternoon wore into evening, and the evening deepened into a night that was darker than any natural night, the ash cloud above blocking every star and every trace of moonlight. The accumulated pumice had reached a depth of more than 2 meters in parts of the city. Roofs were collapsing under the weight. The streets were becoming impassable channels of loose gray stone, and those who had sheltered indoors, waiting for the fall to stop, were now trapped by the very walls they had trusted to protect them. Some had made it to the beach to the south, to the shore itself, where the sea had pulled back in a strange and terrifying recession, the displacement of the ocean floor by the seismic forces at work. Pliny the Elder, the great natural historian and naval commander who had sailed toward the disaster in an act of both scientific curiosity and personal bravery, was among those on the shore at Stabiae, south of Pompeii. He died there on the beach. The fumes, the heat, the physical strain on a man of his age and constitution. His nephew, watching from Misenum, survived to write the account that has outlasted everything else. Now the darkness became absolute. Sometime in the early hours of August 25th, after midnight, perhaps approaching 2 or 3 in the morning, the eruption entered its most lethal phase. The column above Vesuvius, which had been sustaining itself for hours in a roaring upward plume, began to destabilize. The magma chamber below, already depleted, could no longer supply the pressure needed to keep that massive column aloft. It began to collapse. What fell back to earth was not ash and pumice. What fell back was a pyroclastic surge, a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and fragmented rock that moved down the slopes of the mountain at speeds that made escape not merely unlikely, but physically impossible. The temperature within these surges reached hundreds of degrees. They flowed like liquid, seeking the lowest ground, filling every valley and every street, flowing around obstacles and through openings and under doors, and into the lungs of every living thing that had not already fled far enough and fast enough. The first surge struck Herculaneum, north of Pompeii, sometime in the early hours of the morning. It struck so fast that the hundreds of people who had gathered on the beach there, waiting for rescue boats that the rough sea would not permit to land, had no time even for the reflexive act of covering their faces. The heat was so intense and so instantaneous that it vaporized the fluid in their skulls and caused their brains to turn briefly to glass. They died before they understood death was arriving. Pompeii was struck not long after. The surges that reached the city were somewhat attenuated by distance. They had lost some of their most extreme heat by the time they swept over the city walls, but they were still lethal. They were still moving at speeds that no human body could outrun, and they still carried temperatures high enough to kill every living thing in seconds. Those who had survived the long night of pumice fall, who had waited out the terror in their homes, in the temples, in the colonnaded corridors of the Forum, died in the same instant, caught in mid-gesture, mid-breath, mid-prayer. Imagine, if you can bear it, the silence that followed. One moment there were voices, desperate, exhausted, frightened voices calling for family members, calling on the gods, calling out into a darkness that answered with nothing. And then the surge arrived, and then the voices stopped. All of them, all at once. A city of thousands, ending in an instant of heat and blackness and stopped breath. What the pyroclastic material did in the hours and days that followed was seal the city. The fine ash that settled over everything, over the bodies of the dead, over the furniture in their houses, over the bread loaves still in the ovens of the bakeries, over the electoral slogans painted on the walls, over the playing boards scratched into the stone steps of the basilica where legionnaires had passed their idle hours. This ash packed itself around every surface with a fidelity that time could not entirely undo. It filled the hollow spaces left by decomposing bodies and petrified the moment of death as no other force in nature has ever done before or since. The ash fell for 3 days. When it finally stopped, the city of Pompeii was buried under 4 to 6 meters of volcanic material. The coastline had changed. The course of the Sarno River had shifted. The landscape itself was unrecognizable. The survivors who had fled, and there were many, perhaps most of the city's population, those who had heeded the early signs and run, stood at a distance and looked at a place that no longer existed, where their homes had been, where the Forum had stood, where the temple columns had risen white against the mountain's green flank. There was nothing, just gray, just ash, just silence. Pompeii was not excavated in any systematic way for nearly 17 centuries. The city had been known vaguely as a buried place, a rumor in the landscape, a name in old documents, a region where farmers sometimes turned up pieces of worked stone or fragments of mosaic with their plows. But the scale of what lay beneath was not understood until the 18th century, when the Bourbon kings of Naples commissioned the first serious excavations. What the excavators found as they dug down through the layers of ash and pumice was not merely architecture. It was not merely art or artifacts. It was life, unfinished life, a city caught mid-sentence. The bread was still in the ovens, carbonized but recognizable, still bearing the marks of the baker's hands, still showing the stamp of the bakery that produced it. The garum jars were still in their holders at the thermopolium counters, the dried residue of fish sauce still clinging to the clay. A dog was frozen in its final contortions, its chain still attached to the wall of the house it had been guarding. A woman had died with her hands covering her face, her gold jewelry still on her fingers and around her neck. A man and a young child had died embracing, the child's face pressed into the adult's chest, the adult's arms wrapped around the small body. Whether they were father and daughter, mother and son, master and slave, the ash did not record. It recorded only the embrace itself. Follow this moment. Let it settle. There is a particular cast among the hundreds now housed in the museums of Naples and in the Pompeii site itself. The cast of a young woman found near the Nucerian gate at the edge of the city, who had almost made it out. She lies on her side, her head resting on her arm as if sleeping. One hand is raised slightly, the fingers curled. She may have been 12, 13 years old. She wore, the analysis of her remains suggests, fine clothes. She may have been of a good family. She was alone. She had been running, and the surge had taken her just outside the gate, just beyond the wall that had defined the boundary of her city her entire life. She was never given a name by those who found her. The archaeologists simply called her the girl at the gate. She runs through the imagination and will not stop. What Pompeii teaches, what it has been teaching since the first spade broke its centuries of silence, is not a lesson about volcanoes. It is not even finally a lesson about the cruelty of nature or the indifference of geological forces to human ambition. What Pompeii teaches is something both simpler and more devastating, that ordinary life is always extraordinary, and that we do not know this until it is gone. The citizens of Pompeii were not heroic figures from mythology. They were not the marble and laurel senators of Roman legend. They were people who ate fast food at street corners and argued about politics and scratched jokes on walls and fell in love and owed money and raised children and got drunk at the amphitheater and complained about the noise of the neighbor's cart on the cobblestones at dawn. They were, in the truest sense, simply people. People who had a Thursday in August that began exactly as every other Thursday in August had ever begun, and who could not have known, could not have dreamed, that it was also the last day of their world. That is the unbearable thing, not the eruption itself, not the column of fire, not the pyroclastic surge, not the ash that sealed everything in its gray and permanent embrace. The unbearable thing is the gap between the Tuesday and the Thursday, the gap between the life being lived with the careless confidence of those who expect a future and the moment when the future simply stops. The loaves of bread, the dog on its chain, the electoral slogans still wet with paint, the amphora with garum still in it, the girl at the gate. They had no warning sufficient to the danger. They had no framework for what was happening to them. They fled, or they sheltered, or they froze, each making the best decision they could with the information they had. And the mountain did not care, and the surge did not discriminate, and the ash fell equally on the slave and the patrician, on the child and the gladiator, on the merchant and the magistrate. And then the ash was done falling, and then there was silence. And in that silence, a city of people was held, preserved not in memory, which fades, not in story, which changes in the telling, but in the very substance of the earth itself, which does not forget. Pompeii did not disappear. That is the thing to hold on to as this story reaches its end. Pompeii was not destroyed, it was stopped. It was paused at 1 in the afternoon on August 24th, 79 AD, and it has been waiting, in the ash, in the casts, in the mosaics, in the graffiti, and the bread loaves and the girl at the gate, for someone to come and listen. We came, we listened, and we found a city that was, in the end, exactly like ourselves. Alive, busy, impermanent, and more beautiful for not knowing it. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD buried not only Pompeii, but the neighboring towns of Herculaneum, Stabiae, and Aplantis. Estimates of the death toll within Pompeii alone range from 2,000 to as many as 16,000, though the majority of the city's population is believed to have escaped before the final pyroclastic surges. The accounts of Pliny the Younger, written in two letters to Tacitus approximately 25 years after the eruption, remain the only surviving contemporary eyewitness description of the disaster. Systematic excavation of Pompeii began in 1748 and continues to this day.